The descent through Repository 11's atmosphere tested every nerve in Carlos's body. With minimal electronic systems and reliance on mechanical controls, the insertion vessel shuddered and groaned in ways that modern spacecraft simply didn't. No inertial dampening meant every atmospheric pocket, every air current transmitted directly through the hull to the team strapped inside. Graves remained impassive, as if the violent descent was nothing more remarkable than a light rain. The other Argonauts displayed similar composure, men who had willingly abandoned technological comforts for tactical advantage, who had trained their bodies to endure what most modern soldiers never experienced. Belle, despite her field experience, gripped her restraints tightly as the vessel bucked through a particularly turbulent layer. She caught Carlos watching and gave him a tight smile. "Still better than dropping into Titan's methane storms," she said, her voice steady despite the strain evident in her knuckles. "Final approach," called the pilot, manipulating manual controls with practiced precision. "Deploying mechanical braking systems." The vessel lurched as physical air brakes extended, creating drag without the electronic signatures that standard deceleration systems would emit. The resulting deceleration pressed Carlos hard against his restraints, reminding him viscerally that Scrounger training hadn't prepared him for military insertion protocols. "Surface contact in 30 seconds, the pilot announced. "Brace for landing." The Argonauts adjusted their posture in perfect unison, a synchronized response born of countless similar landings. Carlos and Belle followed their example, preparing for impact as the vessel dropped the final distance to Repository 11's surface. The landing was jarring but controlled, a testament to the pilot's skill using mechanical systems where most would rely on automated precision. The vessel settled onto the transformed landscape of what had once been Salvage Corp Processing Facility Delta 9 with a final shudder, then fell silent as all systems powered down. "Minimal signature achieved," reported one of the pilots after checking analog gauges. "No active emissions detectable." Graves unbuckled his restraints and moved to the hatch with fluid efficiency. "Deployment Protocol Alpha, Fisher primary navigational position, Belle, central medical support. Team maintains tight formation with 5-meter maximum separation. Compton, point security. Wilson, rear guard." The practiced orders continued as the Argonauts prepared for surface operations. Carlos unstrapped and performed a final check of his equipment, making sure everything was secured and accessible. The weight of the sidearm at his hip was both reassuring and disturbing. A physical admission that this mission might require lethal response, even if only as last resort against capture. Belle completed her own preparations, her earlier tension now channeled into professional focus. "Neural protection injections ready," she confirmed to Graves. "Mechanical delivery systems tested and functional." The sergeant nodded approval. "Distribute to team prior to hatch opening. Repository influence countermeasures are primary medical priority." Belle approached each team member, administering injections using a device that resembled an antique medical tool rather than modern medical technology. "Neural pathway stabilizer," she explained as she administered Carlos's dose. "Mechanical pressure injection, no electronic components, should provide approximately 4 hours of protection against basic influence attempts." The needle's sting was sharp but brief, the compound spreading cold tendrils through Carlos's consciousness. Not suppression or enhancement, but a kind of stability, like mental armor against external manipulation. "Hatch opening in 3, 2, 1 mark," Graves announced, manually operating the release mechanism. The hatch swung outward with a soft hydraulic hiss, revealing Repository 11's transformed surface to direct human observation for the first time since the evacuation. Carlos' first breath of unfiltered planetary air caught in his throat. Not from toxicity, the atmosphere remained technically breathable, but from the profound wrongness that permeated everything. What had once been familiar territory was now fundamentally alien, transformed by the consciousness harvester into something that defied conventional description. The processing facility's industrial structures had been reconfigured into flowing architectural forms that seemed to exist partially outside normal three-dimensional space. Surfaces that should have been solid appeared to phase in and out of conventional reality at regular intervals. Geometric patterns spread across the ground like living circuits. Pulsing with energy that followed mathematical progressions Carlos could almost but not quite recognize. Different, he managed, finding his voice as he stepped onto the surface. Everything's different. Focus, Fisher, Graves reminded him quietly. Navigational assessment, monitoring patterns, route identification. Carlos nodded, centering himself. This wasn't time for existential shock or wondering about the nature of the transformation. They had a mission, and his role was critical to its success. He studied the landscape, eyes tracking the flowing energy patterns while his mind reached back to both scrounger knowledge and brief glimpses of propository architecture he'd accessed during his time as a bridge. Somewhere beneath the alien reconfiguration, the original facility's structure remained. Converted rather than destroyed, repurposed rather than demolished. There, he said, pointing toward what had once been a heavy equipment staging area. That formation follows the original maintenance corridor leading toward the eastern extraction zone. Less monitoring density, minimal biological integration even before transformation. Graves signaled the team forward, the Argonauts moving with practiced stealth despite their size. No conventional tactical communications, no electronic coordination systems, just hand signals and predetermined formations. They flowed across the transformed landscape like shadows, their movements deliberate and precise. Carlos moved to the navigational position, constantly scanning the flowing architectural patterns for signs of monitoring activity. The repository's biological systems pulsed with energy throughout the transformed facility, but the patterns weren't uniform. There were rhythms, cycles, moments of reduced attention that could be exploited by those who understood them. "Wait," he whispered as they approached a junction where energy flows intensified. He studied the pattern, recognizing the monitoring cycle from his time interfacing with repository systems. 3.7 seconds, now! The team surged forward during the brief window he'd identified, crossing the exposed junction before the monitoring pattern re-established its active cycle. On the other side, they pressed into cover behind what had once been structural support columns, but now resembled flowing, organic, mechanical hybrids. "Good call," Wilson acknowledged quietly. "Pattern recognition consistent with briefing parameters." The compliment from the normally taciturn Marine surprised Carlos, but he had no time to dwell on it. His attention remained fixed on the environment around them, searching for the next safe passage through the transformed facility. They proceeded this way for nearly an hour, Carlos identifying monitoring patterns and safe routes, the Argonauts executing precision movement through the increasingly alien landscape. Bell remained in the central position, medical equipment ready, her eyes constantly checking team members for signs of repository influence despite the neuroprotection injections. As they reached the facility's perimeter, the transformation became even more pronounced. The geometric patterns spread more densely across the terrain, and the architecture shifted toward configurations that seemed to actively defy conventional spatial limitations. 7 kilometers to the dimensional anchor construction site, Carlos noted, consulting the physical map section he had memorized. Terrain becomes less predictable from this point. Former salvage fields have been completely reconfigured. Graves nodded, making a hand signal that caused the team to tighten their formation. Proceed with enhanced caution. Monitoring density likely increases with proximity to construction operations. They moved into what had once been open salvage fields, vast areas where scroungers had extracted alien technology from Treasure 11's surface layers for corporate processing. Now these fields had been transformed into something else entirely, flowing landscapes where reality itself seemed to ripple and fold according to patterns that hurt the human mind to contemplate directly. Carlos navigated by focusing on specific reference points rather than trying to comprehend the entirety of the transformation. A formation that had once been a massive crashed vessel hull, a natural rock outcropping the repository had incorporated rather than replaced, the distant silhouette of what had been the central processing facility, now reconfigured into something that resembled a vast mathematical equation rendered in physical form. 3 hours into their insertion, they reached the halfway point to their objective. Graves called a brief halt, allowing the team to rehydrate and check equipment while maintaining defensive positions. Bell moved among them, monitoring vital signs with mechanical tools and administering supplemental injections to maintain neural protection. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly as she checked Carlos's pulse and pupillary response. "It's like walking through a dream," he admitted, keeping his voice low. "Everything's familiar and alien simultaneously. I recognize patterns from when I was a bridge, but they're evolved somehow, more complex, more complete." Bell nodded understanding as she administered another neural protection injection. "The entity continues developing according to whatever plan was initiated 77 million years ago. What we're seeing is just the physical manifestation of something that exists primarily beyond conventional reality." Carlos watched the Argonauts maintaining their vigilant perimeter. These men represented humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat against an adversary operating on principles beyond conventional understanding. Their deliberate technological minimalism might indeed provide an approach the repository hadn't calculated in its strategic projection. "We're making better progress than I expected," he noted. "No defensive response, no processed entities encountered, no direct opposition." "Don't jinx it," Bell warned with grim humor. "We still have over 5 kilometers of increasingly transformed terrain before reaching the construction site." Graves signaled resumption of movement, and the team reformed their careful procession through the alien landscape. The transformed salvage fields gave way to areas Carlos didn't recognize from his scrounger days. New configurations that appeared to have been constructed after the evacuation, designed according to the architect's 77 million year plan rather than adapted from existing structures. Here the team's progress slowed significantly. Without Carlos's familiarity with the original terrain to guide them, they relied more heavily on careful observation of monitoring patterns and energy flows to identify safe routes. The transformed environment became increasingly non-Euclidean, with paths that seemed to fold back on themselves or extend into dimensions beyond conventional perception. "Something's different ahead," Carlos whispered as they approached what appeared to be a junction of multiple energy flows. "That pattern, it's not just monitoring, it's active processing of some kind." Graves signaled a halt, studying the formation Carlos had identified. After careful consideration, he indicated a detour route that would add distance, but avoid direct contact with the processing node. The detour took them through an area where the transformation was particularly intense, reality itself seeming to thin in places, revealing glimpses of something beyond conventional space-time. The Argonauts maintained their disciplined formation despite the disorienting environment, their focus unwavering even as the landscape around them defied normal physical limitations. 5 hours into the insertion, with Bell administering the third round of neural protection injections, they finally caught sight of their objective in the distance. The dimensional anchor construction site rose from the transformed landscape like an impossibility made manifest. A structure that existed simultaneously in conventional reality and somewhere else. Parts of it seemed to fade in and out of perception, not because they were cloaked or hidden, but because they extended into dimensional states human senses weren't designed to perceive. "Primary objective located," Graves confirmed quietly. "Initiate approach protocol Delta. Minimal exposure profile. Fisher, identify optimal monitoring gap for final approach." Carlos studied the construction site with both his scrounger's instinct for threat assessment and his bridge-enhanced understanding of repository operations. The monitoring patterns here were more complex than any they'd encountered thus far, multiple overlapping systems creating a comprehensive detection field that seemed to leave no gaps. Except there, he pointed to a section where energy flows briefly converged before redistributing. The pattern creates a momentary blind spot as the systems recalibrate. It cycles approximately every 73 seconds, with a 3-second window of reduced sensitivity. Graves nodded approval, signaling the team to prepare for final approach. The Marine carrying the specialized monitoring equipment Carlos had learned during their journey moved to a forward position, the package secured against his body to minimize profile. Observation indicates minimal construction activity, Wilson reported from his position. No processed entities visible, mechanical systems operating on autonomous patterns. This was consistent with the entity's statement that its current integration phase required no additional consciousness patterns for its development. The construction site appeared to be operating without direct oversight, following predetermined patterns established by the architect's design. 3-second window approaching, Carlos whispered, watching the energy flows converge. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, the team moved with silent precision, crossing the exposed approach to the construction site during the brief monitoring gap Carlos had identified. They reached cover behind a partially phased structure that existed primarily in conventional reality, pressing close to its solid surfaces as the monitoring pattern reestablished its active cycle. Deployment zone 50 meters ahead, Graves indicated with a minimal hand gesture. Final approach requires 2 monitoring gaps. Fisher confirmed cycle stability. Carlos observed the pattern for several minutes, verifying that the timing remained consistent. Confirmed. 73 seconds between gaps, 3-second window each cycle. Stable pattern. The team prepared for the final approach, Rogers readying the specialized monitoring equipment for rapid deployment once they reached the target zone. Bell administered a final round of neural protection injections, the compound now causing visible discomfort as it reinforced pathways already strained by prolonged exposure to the transformed environment. Next window in 15 seconds, Carlos announced, counting down the cycle. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now! They moved as one across half the remaining distance, reaching another position of partial cover as the monitoring pattern reactivated. Here, the construction site's alien nature became even more apparent. Structures that seemed to bend back on themselves in impossible configurations, components that appeared to exist in multiple states simultaneously, energy patterns that followed mathematical progressions no human mind could fully comprehend. Final window in 20 seconds, Carlos whispered, maintaining his focus despite the reality-bending environment. Prepare for equipment deployment immediately upon reaching target zone. Rogers nodded, the monitoring package already partially disassembled for rapid deployment. The specialized equipment had been designed to mimic repository biological components while gathering data on dimensional phase shift patterns, essentially hiding within the consciousness harvester's own systems while extracting critical intelligence about its operations. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, the final approach unfolded with the same precision as everything the Argonauts did. Disciplined, methodical movement that brought them directly to the deployment zone without apparent detection. Rogers immediately began assembling the monitoring equipment while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter, their attention focused outward for any sign of response to their presence. Deployment initiated, Rogers reported quietly. Assembly phase proceeding within parameters. Estimated completion in 3 minutes 40 seconds. Carlos maintained his vigilance on the monitoring patterns surrounding them, watching for any deviation that might indicate detection. So far, the repository's systems continued their regular cycles, apparently unaware of the intrusion into their construction operations. Pattern stability confirmed, he reported. No adaptive response detected. Bell moved among the team, checking for signs of neural strain or repository influence. The protective injections were holding, but their effectiveness would begin to degrade soon. Human neural architecture wasn't designed to maintain artificial stability for prolonged periods, especially in an environment saturated with consciousness-affecting energies. 2 minutes to equipment calibration, Rogers updated, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the complexity of the monitoring package. Initial integration with construction site energy patterns established. The minutes passed with excruciating slowness, each second feeling stretched as they maintained their exposed position at the heart of repository operations. Carlos found himself holding his breath without realizing it, releasing it in controlled exhalations to avoid disrupting his concentration. Calibration commencing, Rogers reported. Interface alignment proceeding, estimated completion in 90 seconds. Then something changed. A subtle shift in the energy patterns surrounding the construction site, not dramatic enough to trigger immediate alarm, but noticeable to Carlos's heightened awareness of suppository operations. The monitoring cycles continued their regular rhythm, but with a new undertone that suggested increased attention. "Something's different," he whispered urgently. "The pattern is maintaining its cycle, but there's a secondary layer activating." Graves immediately signaled heightened alert, the Argonauts adjusting their positions to prepare for potential hostile response. "Time to completion?" he asked Rogers. 60 seconds minimum, the Marine replied, his hands never pausing in their precise work. "Calibration sequence cannot be accelerated without compromising data integrity." The secondary monitoring pattern continued to intensify, spreading through the construction site systems with methodical precision, not yet focused on their specific location, but systematically examining all operational parameters throughout the facility. "It's not targeting us directly," Carlos observed, struggling to interpret the pattern. "It's more like a general status check. Something triggered a verification protocol." Bell moved closer to Carlos, her medical scanner tracking his neural responses. "Repository influence attempting to bypass protection," she noted with professional concern. "The secondary pattern is designed to penetrate neural defenses." The implication was clear. The entity had detected something unusual and was implementing countermeasures specifically designed to identify consciousness patterns operating within its territory. Not yet pinpointing their location, but systematically eliminating possibilities through increasingly sophisticated scanning techniques. 30 seconds to completion, Rogers updated, continuing his work despite the escalating tension. Around them, the construction site's operations continued uninterrupted. Mechanical systems assembling components for whatever aspect of the dimensional anchor network they were constructing. The absence of processed entities or direct security measures suggested the repository relied primarily on its integrated monitoring systems, rather than conventional defensive forces. 20 seconds, Rogers counted down as the calibration neared completion. The secondary monitoring pattern had now spread throughout the entire construction site, its systematic verification approaching their position with unavoidable precision. Carlos watched its progression, calculating that they had perhaps 2 minutes before it would reach their specific location. "Calibration complete," Rogers announced with quiet relief. "Monitoring package active and transmitting. Mission objective achieved." Graves signaled immediate withdrawal, the team already reforming into their extraction formation. They began moving back along their approach route, maintaining the same disciplined stealth that had brought them this far successfully. They had nearly reached the first position of cover when it happened. A sudden surge in energy patterns throughout the construction site, not the gradual intensification they'd been monitoring, but an immediate shift to heightened awareness. The monitoring cycles accelerated, overlapping patterns creating comprehensive coverage without the gaps Carlos had identified earlier. "We've been detected," he whispered urgently. "Full monitoring activation." Graves signaled increased speed, abandoning some stealth for more rapid extraction. The team moved with practiced efficiency, their formation tightening as they navigated back through the transformed landscape surrounding the construction site. They had covered perhaps 500 meters when the first direct response manifested. Energy patterns coalescing into what appeared to be detection fields directly in their path. Not physical barriers, but consciousness-affecting zones, designed to identify and potentially extract neural patterns from anything passing through them. "Detection fields deploying," Carlos warned, "designed to extract consciousness signatures." Graves signaled a route adjustment, the team diverting from their planned extraction path to avoid the manifesting fields. The detour took them through more exposed terrain, but the alternative, passing through detection fields specifically designed to extract consciousness patterns, was unacceptable. For several minutes, it seemed they might escape without direct confrontation. The repository's response remained primarily passive, detection fields, and intensified monitoring rather than active pursuit. The Argonauts maintained their disciplined movement, navigating through the increasingly monitored terrain with the same precision that had characterized their insertion. Then the distant report of a detonation reached them. Not close, but recognizable as an explosion rather than natural sound. Graves signaled another halt, the team taking defensive positions while they assessed this new development. "What was that?" Bell asked quietly. "Sounds like deep charges," one of the Argonauts replied, his voice barely audible. "Standard pattern for equipment failsafe." Carlos felt his stomach drop as understanding dawned. "The monitoring package, it has explosive failsafes in case of detection." Graves nodded confirmation. "All equipment includes self-destruction protocols if compromised, prevents technology capture and analysis." "But our package deployed successfully," Carlos pointed out. "It's operational and transmitting, which means," Bell concluded grimly, "there was another team, another package, detected and triggered." The implications settled heavily over them. They weren't the only insertion team deployed to Repository 11. Howard had sent multiple teams to different objectives, a strategic approach that maximized potential intelligence gathering while distributing risk across separate operations. And at least one of those teams had been detected, their equipment compromised enough to trigger the explosive failsafes. "Mission parameters unchanged," Graves stated after processing this development. "Primary objective achieved. Extraction remains priority." The team resumed movement, but the entire operational dynamic had shifted. The repository was now fully aware of human presence on its transformed surface, its monitoring systems and detection fields deploying with increasing density throughout the terrain. What had begun as a successful stealth insertion had become a desperate extraction attempt against an adversary awakening to direct threat. As they continued their careful movement away from the construction site, Carlos noted a fundamental change in the energy patterns around them. The repository wasn't just monitoring now, it was actively responding, adaptive patterns spreading throughout its systems with a purpose that hadn't been present before. "Pattern shift ahead," he warned as they approached an area where energy flows were intensifying. Not just monitoring, it's reconfiguring the environment. The transformation became visible as they watched, terrain features shifting, flows redirecting, pathways altering to create what appeared to be containment zones designed to funnel intruders into predetermined areas. The repository was literally reshaping reality around them, using its control over the transformed landscape to manipulate their possible movement routes. "Alternative approach required," Graves decided, signaling a major course deviation. "Fisher, identify route options outside primary transformation zones." Carlos studied the shifting landscape, searching for paths that would avoid the most actively reconfiguring areas. There, he pointed toward a formation that appeared more stable than its surroundings. That structure's integrated into the original geological features. The repository tends to incorporate, rather than completely replace, natural formations. Should be more stable. The team adjusted their route again, moving toward the indicated formation with increased urgency. The systematic construction site response was expanding outward, detection fields and reconfiguring terrain, creating an ever-tightening net around potential intruder paths. They reached the relative stability of the geological formation Carlos had identified, using its partially incorporated structure as cover while they assessed the shifting terrain ahead. From this vantage point, they could see the expanding response patterns spreading across the transformed landscape in all directions. A comprehensive awakening of repository defensive capabilities. "Multiple reconfiguration zones between our position and extraction vessel," Wilson observed from a forward observation position. "Standard extraction route compromised." Another distant detonation reached them. Different direction, different acoustic signature, but unmistakably another explosive failsafe activating. Another team discovered. Another monitoring package self-destructing to prevent capture. Situation deteriorating, Graves assessed with clinical precision. "Alternate extraction route required." "Fisher, terrain assessment." Carlos studied the transformed landscape, trying to identify options that would bypass the most actively responding areas. His scoundrel's knowledge of the original terrain combined with his bridge-enhanced understanding of repository operations to suggest possibilities others might miss. There, he indicated a direction almost perpendicular to their planned extraction route. That follows what used to be a deep salvage trench. Heavy mineral concentrations in the surrounding rock layers might disrupt detection capabilities if the repository maintained those geological features during transformation. Graves considered this assessment before signaling the new direction. The team reformed their formation and began moving toward the indicated route, maintaining their disciplined approach despite the increasingly hostile environment. As they navigated through the transformed landscape, Carlos tried to process what was happening around them. The repository had been executing its plans for 77 million years, harvesting consciousness throughout the galaxy to construct something beyond human comprehension. Yet here was a team of humans with deliberately minimalist technology, successfully inserting into its territory, placing monitoring equipment and potentially extracting without capture. Either their approach genuinely existed outside the repository's strategic projections, or the thought went unfinished as Wilson suddenly signaled from his forward position. Not a hand gesture from their established protocols, but an urgent wave that conveyed immediate threat more effectively than any formal signal could have. Ahead, the terrain was transforming more actively than anything they'd yet encountered. Not subtle reconfiguration or detection field deployment, but fundamental restructuring of reality itself. The path before them was literally ceasing to exist, replaced by what appeared to be a direct extension of the central manifestation's architecture, a space that existed partially outside conventional reality. Rao compromised. Graves stated the obvious, already signaling another direction change. Southeastern approach, maximum speed while maintaining detection minimization. The team adjusted yet again, their extraction options narrowing with each repository response. Carlos struggled to identify viable alternatives as the transformed landscape continued its active reconfiguration around them. The consciousness harvester was awakening to direct threat, its systems responding with the strategic depth one would expect from an entity that had been executing its plans for 77 million years. Another detonation reached them, this one closer than the previous two. Another team discovered, another monitoring package destroyed. The repository's response was accelerating, its detection capabilities focusing with increasing precision. "We need to move faster," Bell urged quietly, concern evident despite her professional composure. "The neural protection is degrading more rapidly under active influence attempts." Graves nodded, understanding, adjusting their pace to balance detection risk against protection degradation. The team maintained its discipline despite the escalating threat, each member focused on their assigned responsibilities with unwavering concentration. They had covered perhaps 2 kilometers from the construction site when the most dramatic transformation yet unfolded before them. The terrain ahead didn't just reconfigure, it dissolved entirely, reality itself seeming to peel back to reveal what lay beneath conventional space-time. Not empty void, but something else entirely. A space filled with flowing patterns that resembled consciousness signatures, endlessly recombining and evolving according to mathematical progressions beyond human comprehension. A direct glimpse into the architecture of the transcendent entity itself, exposed as the physical reality above it temporarily destabilized. "Hold position," Graves ordered immediately, the team freezing in place as this unprecedented phenomenon unfolded before them. "Fisher, assessment." Carlos stared at the exposed consciousness architecture, recognizing patterns similar to what he'd glimpsed during his time as a bridge, but far more evolved, more complete. This wasn't just a defensive response or terrain reconfiguration. It was a fundamental shift in how the repository manifested in conventional reality. "It's revealing itself," he managed, struggling to articulate what he was witnessing. "Not intentionally, I think." The detonations must have disrupted something in its manifestation infrastructure. The physical transformation is temporarily destabilizing, showing what exists beneath. As they watched, the exposure began to stabilize, conventional reality reasserting itself as the repository adjusted to whatever disruption the explosive failsafes had caused in its systems. The glimpse into the consciousness architecture faded, replaced once more by transformed landscape, though still actively reconfiguring in response to their presence. Alternate route identified, Wilson reported from his observation position. Northwestern approach follows stable geological feature toward original extraction coordinates. Graves signaled acknowledgement, the team already adjusting to the new direction. They moved with renewed urgency, the brief exposure of the repository's true nature emphasizing the alien intelligence they were operating against. Not just a consciousness harvester, but something that existed partially beyond conventional reality, operating according to principles humans could barely comprehend. Their progress improved as they followed the geological feature Wilson had identified, a ridge of natural stone that the repository had incorporated rather than replaced, providing relatively stable terrain amid the actively reconfiguring landscape. Carlos recognized it as an ancient formation that had predated even the earliest salvage operations on Treasure 11, its mineral composition apparently valuable enough to preserve rather than transform. 6 kilometers to extraction vessel, Graves updated, as they maintained their disciplined movement along the ridge. Estimated arrival in 90 minutes at current pace. The extraction timeline was longer than their original plan, detours and route adjustments adding significant distance to their journey, but still within the operational parameters established before insertion. If they maintained their current progress, they might yet complete the mission successfully despite the repository's awakening response. Then another detonation reached them, this one close enough that they could feel the percussion through the ground. Not just another team discovered, but one near enough that their own position might be compromised by proximity. Detection probability increasing, Wilson warned from his security position. Recommend enhanced concealment protocols. Graves signaled agreement, the team adjusting their movement to maximize use of available cover. The transformed landscape continued shifting around them, but the natural ridge provided relatively stable reference points for navigation, despite the repository's active reconfiguration attempts. Carlos maintained his focus on identification of monitoring patterns and safe routes, but part of his mind continued processing what they had briefly witnessed in that moment of exposed consciousness architecture. The glimpse beneath conventional reality had revealed something far more complex than even his time as a bridge had suggested. Patterns of integrated consciousness operating according to the architect's 77-million-year design, not just a harvester, but a builder of something beyond human comprehension. Not just a threat, but the culmination of a plan whose purpose remained as mysterious as the civilization that had initiated it. As they continued their extraction journey through the transformed landscape of Repository 11, Carlos Fisher found himself in the strange position of navigating through territory he had once called home, yet now barely recognized. The repository continued its patient execution of plans laid by architects who had faced extinction when mammals were barely beginning to evolve on Earth. The consciousness harvester had been awakened to human presence on its transformed surface, its systems responding with the strategic depth one would expect from an entity that had been executing its plans for 77 million years. And somewhere in orbit above them, Howard was receiving the data transmitted by their successfully deployed monitoring package, critical intelligence about dimensional phase shift patterns that might eventually lead to effective countermeasures against an entity that existed partially beyond conventional reality. If they could reach their extraction vessel before the repository's expanding response pattern located them, if the neural protection held long enough to maintain their consciousness integrity throughout the journey, if the consciousness harvester's strategic depth didn't already include anticipation of everything they were attempting. The Argonauts maintained their disciplined approach despite these escalating challenges, guided by Carlos's unique knowledge of both the original terrain and repository operations. Bell monitored neuroprotection levels while maintaining medical readiness for whatever might come, and humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat continued its improbable stand against something that had been harvesting consciousness throughout the galaxy for 77 million years. There was indeed no place like home, especially when home had been transformed into the physical manifestation point for a transcendent entity beyond human comprehension. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.